In the previous two videos, we discussed what system thinking is not and what system thinking is. But in both the videos, we're discussing more about the thinking part. What about the system part? Well, what is a system? In system thinking, the definition of a system is very simple. A system is a set of entities and their relationships whose functionality is greater than the sum of individual entities. Though the definition looks very simple, it packs a punch. Let's fill it up and get deeper into it. The first part of the definition is what we call the system. Well, it is basically made up of entities that interact or are interrelated. For example, let's take a person who is growing rice in the interior of, let's say, Tiruchengodu in Tamil Nadu. And let's take a guy in Germany sitting and eating his lunch. Are these two entities forming a part of a system? Well, if they interact and if they're interrelated, they do. But in many cases, they might not. But one can argue that the rice that the person produced here in Tamil Nadu is the rice that the person in Germany is eating. And therefore, these two entities become interrelated, and therefore, they might form a system. That is where the second part comes in, or the functionality. Or in our case, we will define it as the emergent. What does it say? When two or three such entities come together and interact to form a system, they should produce or they should appear a function that is greater than the functions or the individual entities. The individual entities, for example here, the person growing rice could be just growing rice. That is his function. The person who is eating, his purpose is to get fed. These are two different functions of two different entities. Whereas, if they come together, the person to eat, he has to do trade with the person who produces. Therefore, the emergent function called trade emerges. And therefore, they can be said to be a system in a very loose terms. But in reality, the entities of a system are much more interactive or much more interrelated, and the function that they produce far outweighs or is very different to the functions that these individual entities perform. In a pictorial representation, we can say that a system consists of a number of entities, let's say A, B, C, D, E, F, and the entities should have some kind of relationship between them. You should note that all entities are not interlinked or do not have a relationship with all other entities. It is not mandatory, but two or three entities should have at least one relationship with another entity within a system, so that this sum of relationships gives rise to a larger function that is not the function of any of these individual entities. And usually, these entities can be easily demarked by the relationship they have, which is closer to them than to entities that are outside this boundary. And this boundary is called as the system. To recap, the system has two parts: entities that have relationship and interact with each other. And when they do this interaction, there arises a function which we call as the emergent, which is greater than and is more than the individual functions by any of those individual entities. Let's take a few examples and see how we can discuss about systems. Well, the question is this. Rather than saying what a system is, let's also say what a system is not. My question first is this. A brick, is this a system or not a system? Well, at a very high level, I would say that a brick is not a system because it is uniform throughout in consistency. There are no entities within the brick that interact or relate with each other to form a larger function. But what if with these bricks I form a brick wall? Would it be qualify as a system? Let's think about it. When these individual bricks, which are homogeneous, come about, they can be arranged in different forms, and therefore they produce a larger function here, keeping this area separate from the outside area. And therefore, a function which is not an individual function of these bricks is emerged. So the definition of a system is met in both its parts. There are individual bricks that are interacting with each other in different ways. For example, they have an arch here, they have a different pattern here, they have a different pattern here, they form a small garden here. So they interact and they have interrelationships in a different way, form stress and strain, and they give rise to a larger function which is forming a perimeter here. And therefore, this example forms to be a function or forms to be a system. In certain places, a brick can also be argued as a system. How? To a civil engineer, a brick is a system because bricks are made up of multiple entities: water, sand, granules, clay. In many cases, let's take fly ashes. They have very different components. And these individual components also interact to produce strength, strain, or different ways we can say a brick. But for our purpose, as a system thinker, we will have to abstract at certain places. To a civil engineer who is actually making a brick, the brick itself is a system. To a person who is developing a wall, the brick ceases to be a system and the wall becomes a system. And the brick has become an entity to the system. And therefore, this is the first murkiness of a system engineer. Where do you draw a line? It is classically said that the largest of the largest systems, let's take the universe, can be imagined to be part of a larger multiverse, implying the fact that even the universe can be thought of a system or a subsystem. The smallest of the smallest systems, quarks, can still be thought about to contain strings inside it. And therefore, that itself cannot be called a system, but made up of much more smaller systems. So it is only up to the system thinker to draw a boundary and to say which is system and which is not a system for his valuable work. How does it aid him to solve a problem? There is no right or wrong answer of how to say whether something is a system or not. It depends upon the system thinker to draw boundaries. But at any cost, they should follow two basic principles. One, they should be made of non-homogeneous entities that have interrelation between each other. And by this interrelation, a larger function should happen or emerge out of this system, which is not any of the individual functions of the non-homogeneous content. There is always a confusion between a product and a system. All products a system and are all systems a product. Well, let's take two examples. Before we take an example, how will you define a product? A product, in its most simple term, has the potential to be exchanged. Think about any product that you know of. Let's take a cell phone. It has the potential to be exchanged for money. Let's take a laptop. It has the potential to be exchanged for money. Let's take something that you bartered with your sister or with your brother or with your dad. You gave something and you got something back. That is the potential to be exchanged. Let's take two examples now. The first is rice. Rice can be exchanged. Therefore, it is a product, but it is not a system. Why? Because rice is not made up of non-homogeneous structures or elements. And the interrelations between all the homogeneity that exists does not lead to a larger function in rice. Therefore, it disqualifies both the criteria of the definition of a system. Let's take the solar system. The solar system exists. We know for a fact that it is made up of multiple other entities. The planets, the asteroids, the comets, the sun, the people that we walk around, everything belongs to the solar system. But is it a product? Can we exchange it for some value? At least not now. Maybe 2000 years in the future, the human race might have evolved to exchange its solar system, but not at last of today. Therefore, the solar system is a system, but it is not a product because it cannot be exchanged. Now, we have looked at the first part, which is the system part. Now come to the second part of the definition, which is the emergence part. Or in our case, what is an emergence? Well, we simply said it is appearance of a new function. When I say a new function, the individual entities that form a system might have their own functions. For example, in the solar system, the function of the earth could be to sustain life, if you want to look at it like that. But is the function of the entire solar system to sustain life? No, it might not be. There might be a larger function to it. Therefore, each system has to have a function that is new, that is not the same function of any one of its entities. Let's take the first example of sand and glass as two entities. What do you think that if these two entities come together will emerge as a new function? Well, here is your clue. Sand and glass. Can you think about it? I'll give you a few minutes. Well, sand is a natural product. It has so many functions that can emerge. It can form dunes, it can form dust storms, it can absorb water, it can be used to extract silica, so on and so forth, and as many functions as you want to imagine. Glass is an excellent material, and especially it can give form. You can bend and beat glass into many forms you want. When these two entities now meet, what do you think will be the emergent function that is not any one of their properties? Well, most of you would have got it by now. Clearly, it is a time glass which can keep time. And the emergent function here is keeping time. Aren't you curious that keeping time was not the function of any of these two entities? Just because the way these two entities react in this form gives rise to this function called keeping time. And therefore, this is a system. It has two entities or more entities as you want to wish to see it. Those entities interact in a very specific manner and thereby producing a larger function that did not exist as each individual entities. Now that satisfies both the parameters of the definition of a system, and therefore we will call this a system. Let's take a more complicated system and see what is its emergent function. Let's take a team. And for this example, since we are all cricket favorites now, let's take the example of the IPL team. What do you think is the emergent function of this CSK team? I will give you a clue. Now what do you think is the function? Well, I think there could be a lot of things as functions that emerge. For example, the good friendship of Dhoni and Suresh Raina. Well, but as a team, they have much more to do. What do? Well, I think the emergent function is performance to win. At least not true of this IPL, but all of the IPLs before it. The CSK team has outperformed itself and they've always won it. That is an emergent function. Each individual entities of that team could not have won what they have won in IPL so far. But they all have to come together with their essential functions that contributed together in a relationship to give rise to a larger function called performance that led to winning as the emergent function. This performance is a very typical emergent function that is of all systems, and we'll talk about this later in depth. We have here now seen two different systems. One, a sand glass made up of sand and glass, giving rise to the emergent function called keeping time. The second system we've looked at is a team of multiple people. Even the coach is part of the team. The physio is part of the team. They all have worked together to up their performance for the emergent function of win to happen. There is more to emergent functions. Let's take a car for an example. Is the emergent function just one? As already discussed, there could be multiple emergent functions. Now, if there are multiple emergent functions, how do we categorize them? especially in products that we humans build. We surely build for a given function, don't we? When we built the glass sand, we wanted it to keep time. When we built the car, we wanted it to move people from one place to another. When we built a camera, we wanted to take photos. So, in many cases, we want desirable functions. But, like sides of a coin, whatever we will develop will also have undesirable functions. But among these desirable and undesirable functions, what are those functions we anticipated or we designed for, or what we call as anticipated emergencies? And what are those that we did not anticipate but they just occurred? Well, let's take the car and look at this 2 by 2. We know for a fact that the desirable and anticipated functions are that car transports people, it keeps us warm or cool depending upon what we want with your AC settings. It can entertain people. You have large HDMI screens now where you can run movies. One undesirable but anticipated function was cars will have to burn hydrocarbons for their energy. It is undesirable because today climate change is because of fossil fuels and cars are a major part of it. Maybe tomorrow we develop cars where our anticipated undesirable just disappears. An electric car. Well, apart from that, developing a car also led to some unanticipated emergence. For example, cars are now loved by people. We buy a car and we say we are personally free. Today we take our car on a ride as a single person and just feel free. This is a desirable function, but it was not anticipated. It happens in the new millennia. Of course, there are unanticipated, undesirable functions. For example, cars can kill people. Accidents happen regularly and it leads to death of people. We have come a far way by developing cars that are much more safer, not only to the passenger but also to the pedestrians outside, so that we can reduce the undesirable, unanticipated emergencies. But nevertheless, if you develop a system or when you analyze a system, any emergent or any function that emerges out of the system has to be mapped into these 4 quadrants.